So as we know, there are various towers in Tower Defense Simulator, some good and some not as good as others. In this video we are going to rank the towers in TDS in a tier list. Also, before we start, I'm not going to rank all the events towers or the golden towers in this video as I don't have them. So this is the Scout. It's the starter tower of the game. It's free to unlock at the start. It does 1 damage, it has a 1.5 fire rate, 12 range, and it costs $200 to place down at level 0. Even though this is a starter tower, we'll see how it fares against the zombies. Hey there, I forgot to mention the rules for this tier list. So let me tell you, we are testing out all the towers on Fallen mode, as to really test the limits of all the towers. Secondly, we are basing the ranking on how well the towers solo Fallen mode without any supports. Thirdly, the rankings will also be based on how useful the towers are to the average player. Also, support towers will be based in a different criteria. So let's get back into this. Since Scout is an early game tower, it dominated in the early game. The Wave 10 boss was no problem for the Scout. The shadows were also a breeze for the Scouts. The real problems started to show on Wave 18. The breakers showed up and were getting through the Scouts' defense. This was ultimately overwhelming for the Scouts, and with the combination of the Necromancer and the Fallens, the Scouts lost on Wave 10. I personally think the Scouts did amazing, knowing that it is the free starter tower and it is really useful for beginners and pros. So I'm putting the Scout in the C tier. Next up is the Sniper. The Sniper is a cliff tower, meaning that it can't be placed on the ground. The Sniper is also free to unlock at the start. It does 4 damage, 4.5 fire rate, 26 range, and it costs $300 to place down. But even though Sniper has a slow fire rate, it still was able to hold up its own on Fallen mode. The early wave was no problem for the Sniper. The Wave 10 boss was also easy, and the shadows were also easy for the snipers. But just like the Scout on Wave 18, the breakers destroyed the Sniper's defenses and Sniper lost on Wave 19. I think Sniper did really good for a starter tower. It made it really far without any troubles until Wave 18. It's useful for beginners and pros with the cheap placement and high damage. So with that, I'm going to put Sniper in the C tier. The Paintballer, as we all know, is not a good tower, but we still have to test it out. The Paintballer is a splash tower. It costs 150 coins in the shop and it does 2 damage, 2 fire rate, 11 range, and it costs $400 to place down. Going into this, I was not getting my hopes up going into it. The Paintballer did pretty good in the early game, and it was able to take down the Wave 10 boss. But the thing Paintballer lacks is hidden detection, so it was not able to see the shadows, and the Paintballer ended up losing on Wave 14. I think the Paintballer did okay in the early game. It struggles with high HP enemies. The thing holding this tower back is it not having hidden detection. I would not recommend any beginners or pros to use Paintballer. I would personally not buy this tower. So with that being said, I'm gonna have to put this in the E tier. So the Demoman is another splash tower just like the Paintballer. The Demoman costs 250 coins in the shop and it does 4 damage, 2.7 fire rate, 9 range, and it costs $400 to place down. The Demoman did amazing in the early game. The Wave 10 boss was no problem. Even though it didn't take the boss out, it left it low enough for us to survive, but something I didn't know, and I should have known beforehand, is that Demoman doesn't get hidden detection until level 4. So we ended up losing to the shadows on Wave 14. I think Demoman did alright. I should have done a bit more research before. I think this tower is amazing for beginners. I would strongly recommend this tower for beginners because of its splash, damage, and how cheap it is. I think if I had prepared this tower would have done much better. I think this might be a controversial decision, but I'm gonna put Demoman in the B tier. Next up is the Soldier. Going into this one, I expected Soldier to do really good in this, but anyways, the Soldier costs 350 coins in the shop and it does 1 damage, 0.1 fire rate, 13 range, and it costs $350 to place down. The Soldier did good in the early game. The Wave 10 boss, no problem. The shadows, no problem. And surprisingly, the breakers were not too much of a problem. But what ended the run for the soldiers is the Necromancer. The skeletons were too much for the soldiers and they lost on Wave 21. The soldiers were up to my expectations. They did really well. I would recommend this for beginners because of its good damage and how cheap it is to place. Down with that, I'm gonna put the Soldier in the B tier. Before we start this one, I don't think Freezer is going to make it far at all. But nonetheless, the Freezer costs 800 coins in the shop and it does 0 damage, 8 range, 3 fire rate, and it costs $350. Place down, the Freezer did horrible in the early game since it does 0 damage. The Freezer ended up losing on wave 7. Freezer is by far the worst tower I have used so far. It did very bad in the early game. It was not able to take down any zombies at all. The only thing it had going for it is that it was able to freeze zombies. Yet that didn't do much to help. My advice to beginners: do not use this tower at all costs. It's not worth it, so with it I'm gonna put the Freezer in the F tier. This tower really needs a buff. Lastly, we have the Hunter, which actually used to be a code exclusive tower for a long time. But anyways, the Hunter costs 850 coins in the shop and it does 4 damage, 2.5 fire rate, 17 range, and it costs $500 to place down. The Hunter did alright in the early game. The boss was pretty easy. Shadows no problem. But once again, the Breakers did not. Give the Hunter a break and they ended up losing on wave 19. Hunter didn't do too bad. It would not be a bad tower for beginners, but I think other towers do its job much better. So with that, I'm gonna put the Hunter in the C tier. So that is all the starter towers in this section of the video. If you want to intermediate towers, like the video. If we reach 10 likes, it'll do it. Alright, that's it for now. Bye.